In the shadowed corners of Whitmore Falls, there were whispers about the Whitmore twins, Clara and Elias, whose bond was like no other. From the day they were born, they seemed to exist as two halves of the same soul. The townspeople, uncomfortable with their unnatural closeness, often spoke of how the twins would finish each other's sentences or silently understand what the other was thinking. It was as though they shared not only a home, but a mind. Their connection grew deeper as they aged, and their dependency on each other became the foundation of their lives. No one dared question it, for fear that what they witnessed was something better left unexplored. As children, they would often be found playing alone in the woods, speaking in strange riddles that no one could understand. It wasn't just the way they communicated, it was how they seemed to know things they shouldn't. A glance from Elias could send Clara into an uncontrollable fit of laughter or tears, and she could do the same to him. The intensity of their bond wasn't just noticed, it was feared. There were those who believed their connection was a gift, but even more believed it was something darker, an omen that would soon unfold with terrifying consequences. The more time passed, the more inseparable they became. By their teenage years, the twins had grown into an eerie reflection of each other, so much so that it was often difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. Their relationship went beyond sibling affection, becoming a dependency that surpassed anything the townspeople had ever witnessed. Clara and Elias refused to interact with anyone who wasn't one of them. If separated, even for a short period, they would experience an overwhelming sense of loss, as if a part of them had been torn away. One stormy night, during their 16th year, the twins vanished from the town without a trace. They reappeared days later, not a single word spoken about where they'd been or what had happened. But those who dared approach them noticed an unsettling change. Their bond had deepened in ways that felt unnatural. Their eyes seemed to burn with an intensity no one could explain, as though they had touched something beyond the living world. The air around them grew thick, and the townsfolk began to whisper, wondering if Clara and Elias had made a pact with something older and darker than they could understand. Despite the increasing tension in Whitmore Falls, no one could separate the twins. Clara and Elias became more insular, only trusting one another. They no longer seemed to be content with the life they had, growing more restless with each passing day. The townspeople started to fear for their safety, worried that whatever bond had been formed between the twins was no longer simply psychological. It was something far more sinister, and it seemed as though the twins couldn't or wouldn't live without each other, no matter the cost. Their connection had evolved into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. As Clara's health began to decline, Elias's fear turned into something far more disturbing. He became obsessed, unable to think of anything but keeping them together, no matter the cost. Clara's pale face and weakened body were a daily reminder of the fragility of life, and Elias couldn't bear the thought of losing her. It was no longer about love. It was about possession. The mere idea of living without Clara was unbearable, and this fear consumed him. At night, he would sit by her bedside, murmuring old incantations, desperate for a solution to what seemed like an inevitable fate. The town began to notice the change in Elias. He stopped attending to the few duties he once had, and his days were spent scouring ancient texts and seeking out old folk remedies that promised to defy death. He became obsessed with stories of eternal bonds, where souls remained connected beyond the grave. The twins, who once seemed inseparable by love, were now bound by something darker. Elias's obsession took on an almost manic quality. He believed that if he could somehow bind their souls together, they would never have to be apart again. The obsession had become all-consuming. As Clara's condition worsened, Elias grew more desperate. He began visiting local cemeteries at night, speaking to the dead, seeking knowledge from those who had crossed over. He believed that their connection, their bond, was the key to a permanent union, even in death. One night, he found an old ritual in an obscure book, a dark and forbidden practice that promised to fuse two souls forever. The price, however, was steep. Elias ignored the warnings, thinking that nothing was too great if it meant keeping Clara by his side forever. But as the ritual required, they would have to make a terrible sacrifice. Clara, still weak and unaware of the full extent of Elias's plans, began to sense something was wrong. The house felt colder, the air heavier, and the nights grew darker. She would hear Elias whispering to himself, chanting words she didn't understand. When she asked him what he was doing, his answers were vague, but his eyes were full of desperation. The twins' connection had grown so powerful that Clara could feel the pull of Elias's obsession, even as she grew weaker. She began to fear that her illness was only part of the dark path Elias was leading them down. One evening, as the full moon illuminated the night sky, Elias completed the ritual. The room grew eerily still, and for a moment, it felt as if time itself had stopped. Clara, still in her frail state, was barely conscious, but Elias could feel the change. Something dark had begun to stir. His heart raced, knowing that this was the moment when everything would either fall apart or be sealed forever. He leaned over Clara, whispering a promise that they would never be apart again. But in the silence that followed, something shifted in the room, as if the air had thickened with unseen forces. The next morning, Clara's condition took a strange turn. Her body no longer appeared to weaken, but it also didn't improve. She seemed different. Her eyes, once soft and full of life, had become cold, distant. She no longer responded to Elias in the way she once did. It was as if the ritual had done something more than keep them together. It had changed her. Elias watched in horror as the very person he had desperately tried to save began to slip away, not physically, but mentally and spiritually. Clara was no longer fully herself, and Elias could feel the creeping presence of something else in her. The town, too, began to notice. The once lively twins were now cold and distant. Their presence became an eerie specter, and those who encountered them spoke of a chill that followed wherever they went. Elias refused to leave Clara's side, and her increasingly strange behavior only fueled his obsession further. He would do anything to keep her by his side, even if it meant losing her forever to something else entirely. The twins' bond had become so twisted that it could no longer be undone, and they were bound in a way that no one could comprehend. But this dark connection came at a price that neither could have ever anticipated. As the days went on, Elias's obsession began to spiral. He was no longer concerned with Clara's well-being. He only wanted to keep her from slipping away, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The town, now aware of the twins' strange behavior, began to fear the Whitmore house. No one dared to approach, and whispers of the dark bond between Clara and Elias spread like wildfire. But what they didn't know was that the twins' obsession had already reached a point beyond redemption. The price of eternal unity would soon demand its toll, and no one, not even Clara or Elias, could escape the darkness they had invited in. The room was heavy with tension as Elias set the stage for the ritual. The walls seemed to close in on him, but he was determined. The ancient book, stained and worn from years of neglect, was the only guide he had left. Its cryptic instructions were clear. Blood would be the key. The moonlight, filtering through the cracked window, cast eerie shadows across the floor. Clara, frail and pale, lay on the bed, unaware of the full extent of Elias's actions. His hands trembled as he prepared the altar, setting candles in a circle around her. The symbols on the floor were old, sinister, but Elias was beyond hesitation. He had already crossed the line. Elias began the incantations, his voice low but steady. With every word, the air grew colder and a heavy silence blanketed the room. Clara stirred slightly as if disturbed by an unseen force. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't stop now. He had promised to never let her go, and this ritual was the only way to keep his promise. The candles flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows on the walls as the power of the ritual began to take hold. The darkness seemed to grow deeper, thicker, and the room felt alive with an ancient, unseen presence. Clara's breathing quickened, but Elias didn't notice. He was focused solely on completing the ritual. As Elias continued the chant, the atmosphere grew dense with supernatural energy. Clara's body began to twitch involuntarily, her fingers curling into the sheets and her eyes shot open, wide and unblinking. It was as if she could hear the ritual in her very soul, feel the pull of the dark forces Elias was invoking. The energy between them grew, but it was no longer just a bond. It was a fusion of fates, of souls intertwining in a violent union. The shadows in the room twisted, and Elias could feel an invisible force clawing at his very being. He was no longer just performing the ritual. He had become part of it. The room seemed to pulse with every heartbeat, the air crackling with an electric charge that burned the skin. The moment came, the final incantation. Elias hesitated for the briefest second, but his obsession for Clara was too strong. He spoke the last words of the chant, and in that instant, the candles flared violently. A sharp, piercing cry filled the room. Clara's body arched off the bed, her hands reaching for Elias as if to pull him into the abyss with her. The very air felt suffocating, as if the life had been drained from the room. Elias, his heart racing, felt an icy chill running through his veins. The bond had been sealed, but it was not the reunion he had hoped for. It was something far darker. In the stillness that followed, Elias stood frozen, staring at Clara's lifeless body. She was no longer breathing, but her eyes, wide and unblinking, stared into his soul. There was no warmth in her gaze, only emptiness. For a moment, Elias thought he had failed, but then an overwhelming sensation washed over him, as if the very essence of Clara had merged with his. He felt her presence, her soul intertwined with his own. It was an unnatural feeling, as if he were no longer truly himself. The ritual had worked, but at what cost? Clara's death had bound them together, but it had also torn apart the veil between the living and the dead. The air in the room began to pulse, heavier and colder with each passing second. Elias tried to move, to wake Clara, but his body felt heavy, as if something was holding him in place. A low, guttural sound filled his ears, the sound of something moving in the shadows. And then Clara's body stirred. Her eyes remained open, but they no longer looked human. Her mouth opened, and a voice not her own whispered in a chilling tone, "We are never apart." Elias's blood ran cold as the darkness he had invited into their lives began to take shape. He had bound them together, but the price was far greater than he could ever have imagined. The night stretched on, the house groaning as if it were alive with the weight of what had just transpired. Elias could feel Clara's presence inside his mind, her every thought and emotion swirling around his own. She was no longer just a part of him. She was a parasite, feeding on his every moment. The bond they shared was no longer one of love, but of something far more sinister, something that could not be undone. Elias had hoped to keep Clara with him forever, but in doing so, he had sealed their fates in a twisted eternity. The ritual had worked, but the consequences were far beyond anything he had ever imagined. As the hours passed, the air grew colder still, and the shadows deepened. Clara's lifeless body no longer seemed like her own, and the room had become a prison. Elias tried to break the bond, to undo the ritual, but the more he struggled, the stronger the grip became. Clara's voice whispered in his mind, urging him to stay, to never leave her side. He was trapped, not just in the house, but in the very curse he had unleashed. The ritual had bound their souls together, but the price was their very existence. They were bound in death, and neither could live nor die alone. The days passed, but time seemed to lose its meaning. Clara and Elias were trapped in a limbo, neither truly alive nor fully dead. They moved through the house like ghosts, their bodies slowly decaying while their souls remained painfully tethered to one another. They could feel the other's every thought, every emotion, as if they were trapped inside a shared consciousness. It was a never-ending cycle of longing and agony, a connection that bound them so tightly that it became impossible to discern where one ended and the other began. They could no longer leave the house without excruciating pain, their flesh deteriorating further with each step they took. Clara's once beautiful features had become gaunt, her eyes hollow and distant, yet there was an unnatural gleam in them, something that should not have been there. She moved like a shadow, her every action deliberate and lifeless, yet her presence was all-consuming. Elias, too, had changed. His skin had taken on a sickly, pallid hue, and his movements were slow, as if he were walking through water. He could feel Clara's presence constantly at the back of his mind, her thoughts and desires mingling with his own. It was a connection that had once been their greatest gift, but now it was their greatest torment. As the days turned into weeks, their isolation became more unbearable. The house, once a place of security, now felt like a prison. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, as if the very walls were closing in on them. Their connection, which had once been a source of comfort, now felt like a suffocating chain. They couldn't escape it, not physically nor mentally. Every thought, every emotion was shared between them, a constant reminder that there was no separation, no freedom. It was as if their souls had become one, but in doing so, they had lost all sense of individuality. The pain of their existence was unrelenting. Their bodies, though unable to die, were deteriorating at an alarming rate. Flesh hung from their bones, and their movements grew more stiff and unnatural. The house, which had once been a sanctuary, now seemed like a tomb. They could no longer eat nor sleep without pain. Yet, despite the agony, neither could die. The ritual had worked, but its cost was too great. They were bound together in a way that no mortal should ever be. They had exchanged their humanity for immortality, but now they were neither living nor dead, forever trapped in a world that could not understand their existence. As the curse of the ritual set in deeper, Clara and Elias realized the horrifying truth. They were not only bound to each other, but they were also bound to the house. It had become a part of them, just as they had become a part of it. The walls seemed to whisper in the dead of night, calling to them, reminding them of the price they had paid. They could never leave, they could never escape. The ritual had promised eternal unity, but it had cursed them with endless suffering, forever tethered to one another and the house that now held their souls captive. The true cost of immortality was not the endless years they would endure, but the torment of never being free again. As the decades passed, the once beautiful Whitmore estate stood abandoned and decaying, a symbol of the twisted fate of the twins. The mansion, once filled with the sound of laughter, now echoed with an eerie silence, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the rustling of wind through broken windows. From the outskirts of the town, the looming presence of the house seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. No one dared approach it, for it was said that the house itself had become a living entity, its very walls infected by the dark bond that Clara and Elias had forged. The twins were now nothing more than spectral figures in the minds of the townspeople, a terrifying reminder of the dangers of obsession. Local children dared each other to get as close as they could to the mansion, but none ever ventured far enough to confirm what everyone feared. Those who did return from the vicinity of the house spoke of strange occurrences. Their shadows seemed to move on their own. Whispers followed them, even when they were alone, and there was a lingering coldness in the air that made their skin crawl. The townspeople had long since abandoned any hope of the twins' redemption, and the mere mention of their names now sent a chill through the community. The twins, who had once been cherished, were now a cautionary tale, a warning to anyone who dared to meddle with forces beyond their control. One night, a young man, drunk and daring, decided to enter the mansion. Armed with only a lantern, he pushed open the rusted gates and stepped inside. As he ventured deeper into the house, he reported seeing flickers of movement from the corners of his eyes, shadowy figures that seemed to be watching him. The further he went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, until the air itself felt thick and suffocating. The man called out, hoping to provoke a response from whatever haunted the place, but no reply came. Instead, he was met with the feeling of something cold and wet brushing against his neck. His heart raced as he turned to flee, but his foot caught on a loose board, sending him crashing to the ground. He never made it out. The next morning, the townspeople found him lying on the outskirts of the Whitmore estate, his face contorted in terror. He was alive, but his eyes were vacant and he could barely speak. The only words he managed to utter were fragmented whispers. "They never leave." His cryptic statement only fueled the fear that had been growing in the town for years. What had once been considered a tragic family tale now seemed like a warning, a sign that the twins were not merely dead or gone, but that they had become something much worse. They were no longer bound by the rules of the living. The legend of the Whitmore twins continued to spread, growing more twisted with each retelling. Some claimed that Clara and Elias had become the very essence of the mansion itself, haunting the halls, forever trapped in their endless obsession. Others whispered that they had crossed over into a realm where time and space had no meaning, trapped in a perpetual loop of longing and suffering. As the years passed, the house grew more dilapidated, its once majestic structure slowly sinking into the earth. But despite its decay, the energy around it remained palpable, as though the twins' presence was somehow preserving it, ensuring their existence continued. The fear that consumed the town was not just the fear of the unknown, but the fear of what the twins had become. They were no longer simply ghosts. They were something darker, something that defied explanation. The curse that had been placed upon them was not just a result of their twisted obsession. It was a consequence of their refusal to let go of each other, of their desperate attempt to exist forever. They had wanted immortality, but what they had gotten was far worse. The townspeople could feel it in the air around them, in the oppressive silence that hung over the estate like a heavy fog. Clara and Elias Whitmore had become the embodiment of the curse they had so desperately sought to control. For many, the fear of the twins became an obsession of its own. Some became obsessed with the idea of breaking the curse, while others simply sought to forget the legends that plagued their town. But those who dared to speak their names in hushed tones did so with caution, as though even uttering the twins' names could bring about some terrible fate. No one dared approach the mansion, and even the bravest souls avoided the area at night. For the Whitmore twins had become something beyond human comprehension, and the town would never be the same again. The fear of their eternal bond lingered, infecting the very air of Whitmore Falls. The curse had taken hold, and it would never let go. The Whitmore twins had once been inseparable, bound by an unbreakable connection, but now they were more than a mere legend. They had become a dark force, forever tied to the town of Whitmore Falls, and their haunting presence would echo for generations to come. The mansion, now overgrown with ivy and surrounded by an impenetrable fog, stood as a silent reminder of their twisted fate. No one could explain what had happened to them, nor would anyone dare to try. The curse of the Whitmore twins would remain, lingering in the shadows, forever waiting for someone to unlock the truth of their twisted obsession. The group, armed only with flashlights and the fading courage to continue, made their way through the decrepit halls of the Whitmore mansion. The air was heavy, thick with an oppressive silence that swallowed every sound they made. The once grand staircase now sagged under years of neglect, and the walls were covered in a damp, sticky residue. It felt as if the house itself was breathing, shifting slightly with every step they took, as though it were alive and aware of their presence. The floors groaned under their weight, each step feeling like it could be their last. As they ventured deeper into the mansion, the group began to experience strange, unexplainable occurrences. The walls seemed to pulse, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. The temperature dropped sharply, and an overwhelming sense of dread settled over them. Whispers filled the air, soft at first, but growing louder as if voices from the past were trying to communicate. The house seemed to respond to their every movement, shifting and changing, closing doors behind them and opening new paths that led them deeper into its twisted heart. They were not alone. Something was watching them. It was then that they encountered the first of the twins, Clara. But she was not the living, breathing girl they had once heard of in the stories. She stood before them, her eyes vacant, her face as pale as the moonlight filtering through the broken windows. She did not speak, but merely stared, her presence freezing the air around them. As they tried to speak to her, to ask her what was happening, her lips curled into a smile that sent chills down their spines. She reached out, but before they could react, the room around them shifted again, and they were no longer in the hallways of the mansion. The house had changed its form, and they now found themselves in a vast, endless void. The walls were gone, replaced by a swirling darkness that seemed to stretch into infinity. They could no longer feel the ground beneath them, and a cold wind howled around them, carrying with it the whispers of lost souls. The twins, Clara and Elias, now appeared before them, their forms ethereal and twisted. They were no longer the innocent children of the past, but warped, monstrous versions of themselves, bound together by the curse they had created. The mansion had become a prison for them, and now it sought to claim the souls of those who dared to enter. The group realized too late that the twins' obsession had created not just a bond between them, but a horrific, self-contained world, one that fed off the living. They were trapped in the realm that the twins had crafted, a world where time had no meaning, and the dead walked among the living. As they tried to escape, they found themselves in endless loops, unable to break free. Each room they entered seemed to lead them back to the beginning, and with every turn, they grew weaker, their strength slowly draining away. The mansion itself seemed to hunger for their souls, the very walls pressing in on them. Desperation set in as the group realized that they were being drawn closer to the source of the curse. They could see the twins in the distance, standing in the center of the mansion, their bodies now fused together in a grotesque, unholy union. The bond between them had become a living nightmare, a force that consumed everything in its path. It was clear now that the twins were not simply bound by love or obsession. They had become prisoners of their own making, trapped in an eternal cycle of suffering and death. And the mansion, alive with their cursed presence, would never let them go. As they fought to survive, the group realized the true horror. In entering this world, they had become part of the curse. They were now bound to the twins, their fates sealed, their souls forever tethered to the mansion's dark heart. Every attempt to escape only seemed to pull them deeper into the madness. The mansion had claimed them, and as the walls closed in, they understood that they would never leave. The bond between Clara and Elias had become a black hole, drawing in every living soul that dared to cross its threshold. No one would escape this cursed place. In the final moments, as the group succumbed to the pull of the mansion, they could only watch as the twins turned to face them, their eyes full of sorrow and longing. They had created this nightmare, and now it was consuming them all. The house would remain, a silent monument to the twisted obsession of the Whitmore twins, and anyone who ventured near would become part of their dark, eternal world. The curse would never break, and the mansion would stand forever as a warning to those who dared to seek the truth behind the twisted obsession of the Whitmore twins. As the group stumbles through the shifting maze of the mansion, a cold realization dawns upon them. There is only one way to end the torment they've been subjected to. A whispered legend, passed from one lost soul to another, tells them of a horrifying truth. The only way to break the twins' unholy bond is through sacrifice. One of them must die to sever the twisted connection between Clara and Elias. The realization hits hard. No one is willing to be the one to offer up their life, but they know it's the only hope they have. They are caught in a battle of wills, save themselves or end the curse forever. The twins, sensing the group's newfound determination, grow more agitated, more dangerous. Their once childlike appearances have warped into something monstrous, as if their souls have been distorted beyond recognition. Their eyes burn with anger and sorrow, as if they know what must be done, yet cannot bear it. Elias and Clara, now consumed by their obsession, lash out with violent force, determined to keep their bond intact at any cost. The mansion itself seems to pulse with their agony, the walls closing in around the group. Every step they take toward freedom only makes the twins more desperate. The group finds themselves trapped in the center of a massive crumbling room, the very heart of the mansion. The air is thick with the stench of decay and despair. The twins stand before them, their forms flickering between the living and the dead, their voices rising in a haunting chorus, begging for their bond to remain unbroken. A struggle ensues as the group fights not only for their lives, but for the chance to end the horror that has consumed these two souls for eternity. But there is a price to pay, and they know it. Only one life can end this nightmare. In the chaos, one member of the group steps forward. Without words, they make the ultimate sacrifice, knowing that it is the only way to save the others. The twins' screams echo through the mansion as the bond begins to unravel, their connection severed with the death of one of the intruders. As the group watches, they can feel the mansion shift, the oppressive energy finally beginning to lift. The air grows lighter, and the walls, once alive with the twins' torment, begin to crumble. The curse, it seems, is finally broken, but at a devastating cost. The final moments are a mix of relief and sorrow. The mansion is no longer the dark, twisting prison it once was, but the loss of one of their own leaves, a deep scar on the group. The twins, their faces filled with agony and confusion, disappear into the shadows, their spirits finally freed from their eternal bond. The group, now forever marked by the horrors they endured, walks away, the weight of their sacrifice heavy on their hearts. They will never forget the twisted obsession that almost claimed their lives. The Whitmore twins are gone, but their curse will live on in the memories of those who survived.